Hello class, this is lecture 4 of Environmental Science 1401, and we're going to be introduced to the topic of population dynamics, looking at how animals and humans tend to reproduce in their environment. So there's some key terms we need to know when we look at population dynamics. And again, what we're looking at is mostly sexually reproducing creatures, although some of this does correspond to creatures that asexually reproduce. That means reproduce without the benefit of mating. Okay. Um, when we look at the term population, particularly, because we're going to be looking at populations, really not individual animals, because population growth occurs within, obviously, a group of animals. So population is a group of individuals. And again, this could be humans, animals, or plants, actually, or microorganisms. So it's a group of individuals of the same species inhabiting the same area. So that means we could be looking at a particular type of deer or a particular type of tree, or we could look at humans in a particular country. So what we do know is that within a population, there are genetic differences that exist, and sometimes this makes it difficult to understand a population. And one example is wolves, where wolves can come in what's called the gray roof pattern and a white wolf pattern, and sometimes even darker wolves. So do we count them as the same population or not? It all depends, where they live and if the variation is due to a restricted environment. Now, one important term we'll be using that has actually two terms to go along with it is the concept of natality, or we sometimes call it birth rate. And sometimes you'll hear the term fecundity related to that, but it's somewhat of a different concept in a way. But natality or birth rate basically means the number of individuals added to a population through reproductive methods, or, and that could be asexual or sexual reproduction over a period of time. And this is very important to say over a period of time. We usually look at a reproductive period that is relative to the creature itself, not just over a year, because some creatures don't reproduce for several years or have very long gestation periods, which they give birth once they're inseminated. So natality or birth rate is measured as, in the case for humans, the number of humans born per 1,000 individuals per year, because our reproductive cycle is less than a year, but usually within a 9-month period, we're not likely to have a kid within the remaining 3 months of the year. Now, so natality is an important measure because that looks at how the population is growing or adding new creatures based on the type of reproduction and number of offspring produced per mating. Now, the term mortality is the number of deaths in a population over a particular period of time. So this is also called death rate. So both terms are acceptable. In the case of humans, what we look at is humans that died per 1,000 individuals per year. So usually when we're looking at data about birth and death, we usually pick the same year timelines. So like if we're looking at population growth between, let's say 1920 and 2030 for a particular, let's say tree or squirrel or whatever population, we will measure both of those, natality and mortality, within that period. Now, one type of measurement that's not always taken into account with population characteristics is a condition called morbidity. And this also means the rate of disease or the disease rate or illness rate. So this is the number of illnesses in a population, again, over a particular period of time, usually measured together with natality and mortality. So the morbidity rate is also done in number of illnesses per 1,000. And why do we do it per 1,000? We've mentioned early in the class that if you just say, well, 500 deer died, you got to know of what size population did those 500 deer die. Was it in a population of 1,000 or a population of 10,000? So we could use this number to come up with a percentage over time using the appropriate mathematical conversions. Now, why is morbidity important? Because the creature's not necessarily dead, but creatures that are ill could often reduce the reproductive rate. So an ill creature is likely not to mate, or an ill youth, a young animal that is born ill, might die before it reproduces. Now, probably one of the more difficult things to look at in environmental science when we talk about population growth is something called a survivorship curve. And basically what this does is it shows for all the organisms born over a period of time through their lifespan how many died. So the way I can measure a survivorship curve for our class is I can look at how many people in the class were born, you know, during a particular time frame, and then over time, as we age, how many die over a certain period. And usually what we look at is the average lifespan of that creature. And that's going to vary a lot from creature to creature, because some creatures live for days. Others, like certain trees, can live for 6,000, 7,000 years. And, certain tortoises can live a couple of hundred years. So when we look at survivorship curves, what we usually do is we can graph this data of basically deaths per population over time. And again, we don't take into account morbidity unless it leads to death. Okay, is we can break this down into 3 survivorship curves that we can recognize. And these survivorship curves are designed to understand species of creatures that have a high mortality of the young. And that means a creature can give birth to sometimes 10,000, 100,000 young, like in the case of some insects and parasitic creatures, or even plants and trees. But 90% of those young could die before the first week of life, before they even reach, their equivalent of reproductive age. Then there are species that have what's called equitable death throughout time, and that means a certain percentage literally equally dies over time. And what causes this? It has to do with the nature of predators and disease and the population density of those creatures. That means the number of creatures living in a certain area. And then there are creatures with a mortality rate that is only high in the aging. So that means these creatures survive very well as youth all the way to reproductive age, and then they die off usually as a result of aging. So here are the pictures of these survivorship curves represented in 2 ways. In the above image, we can see an example of humans as a survivorship curve we call type 1. And this means with humans, guys, in the average society today, this is not true really in developing countries, but somewhat representative of those countries, but not as much as ours, is that we see that very few people die as children, very few people die as teens, and very few people die right at reproductive age, and then slightly after reproductive age. Death usually occurs after what we call post-reproductive age. That means that those reach a period of time where their bodies are not, reproducing anymore due to habit, due to the physiology of the body, resulting in aging, and a lot of people just die off within a certain period. And we sometimes call this period lifespan, particularly in humans. So where you see in this graph where the drop-off occurs, this could be anywhere from 65 to 100 years old, probably an average worldwide of about 70 years old, where most of this population dies off. So the way this graph works is that the y-axis, the up and down axis, we're starting out with 1,000 people and measure them over time for about, let's say, 100 years. And this is what we see, the population steady over time and then drops with the elderly. Now the second graph, what's called the type 2, this is a graph where, let's say, for example, a bird, because a lot of birds, small birds, particularly follow this type of curve, and you have a certain amount die as their eggs because they're preyed upon or just die out of genetic defects or environmental conditions. Let's say, a rainstorm blows them out of the tree, and then over time their population just dwindles slowly. And not as slowly, of course, as type 1, but there's an equal chance of dying as an egg, as an individual from basically youth to middle age, let's say, and then a certain amount of elderly die. This type of curve, it's really a straight line in a way, we call it a curve, is representative of many types of creatures. Now, then we look at what's called a type 3. And this is where, again, we're starting with 1,000, and notice the steep drop off. Incredible amount of the young ones die to the point where right when they start reaching reproductive age, they start surviving and doing well. And this is typical for many types of trees, many aquatic organisms, many insects, where they just produce so many young that these young die off. And usually what happens here is they're dying off due to lack of habitat, overcrowding in the habitat, or else predation. And we see this, again, a lot in insects where they just overpopulate an area and then predators eat them or the creatures just die, competing for food and whatever, taking up resources and literally starving to death sometimes, or having sometimes even no place to settle in and grow like a plant would run into. So understand these three survivorship curves. And below are some examples of animals that have these curves. And notice in the diagram below, these are not perfect curves. They vary over time, they vary with environmental conditions, and just with the nature of cyclic events of the organisms. That means sometimes interactions with their predators or with their food sources. So these are important curves to understand because we use these particularly in understanding agriculture with crop productivity. If a crop dies off, is it going to be a problem? If it's a crop that is not yet reproductive age and, there's not enough of them to make up for the loss, or when we look at something like oysters, where oysters, they produce billions and billions of children over time, but most of those children die. I mean, literally from generation to generation. And after the 60-year lifespan of an oyster, each oyster might produce only 2 children between them, the most. And that's incredible. Now, why do we need to know that? Because that means this tiny population of oysters that started out from 1,000 are the only oysters left to produce that population. And if you trim that adult population by 10%, that means it's over harvesting oysters, you can drop the number of oysters in the next generation to start out at only, at a smaller number. And that could become a problem over time. And we're seeing that particularly in fisheries and in harvesting of certain, plants and animals, other animals besides, oysters. But we see this a lot. And it can cause a decimation and eventually extinction if we wipe out the adults. As a matter of fact, these type of tables are used to understand hunting quotas and fishing quotas. And again, we use it in crop production, particularly when there's an event that causes crop death and, a lot of loss of individuals. Now, some other things we can look at when measuring population growth, besides those curves, because those curves are used for planning, for understanding nature in general. And we can look at those curves and redo them based on environmental changes, based on, if a predator is lost or a new predator comes in or if an organism loses its food source. Now, there's also things we could look at too with, for example, like population growth rate, which is a measure of the birth rate minus the death rate. And this is used a lot to understand human population growth, as far as what resources are expected in an area. And we could also use it to understand nature as far as we can get a baseline, what the population growth is supposed to be like, or growth rate, I should say, and then look at how this is affected by, let's say, harvesting of trees or hunting or loss of food supply for those creatures. We could also look at sex ratio and look at what's the proportion of males and females over time. Now, some creatures that don't have gender, obviously, we don't worry about that. And some creatures have what's called fluid gender. That means males and females could go back and forth depending on environmental conditions or the density of the population or or the amount of nutrition in that environment. We use this a lot for humans, identifying male and female in the classical traditional way that we do. I mean, this is kind of, up against many of the things we believe today about gender and sex, but this is the way people that study this, called epidemiologists, do this, or people that are just looking at population in general do this. Then we have what's called age distribution graphs. And this is looking at, it's a weird type of graph that at a slice of time, let's say 2015, we count or do an estimate of certain age range groups. So we might look at 0 to 2 years old, 2 to 4, whatever denomination we want to set. We can do it in increments of 10. What we try to determine is what's called age distribution. That means for every age range we pick, we try to look at how many people are there per age group over a period of time. And this is used a lot to understand, particularly in humans, we use it a lot, if a population is growing or diminishing, let's say in a region, in a country, or globally. And usually we do this countrywide and sometimes regionally to understand, is a population going up or down? Is the male population growing faster than the female, or blah, blah, blah. And usually we also divide this into pre-reproductive age, because that means if there's a lot of pre-reproductive population, that means that that population, if it's huge, it can contribute a lot to the older populations. That means they move up and then have children, and they can grow that population. If the younger population, the pre-reproductive population is low, that means there's less individuals to reproduce and to add to the next generations. Basically, population growth rate. And these are looking at 3 different countries. This is classical data, which probably holds true today. And these are not the only, I mean, there's other countries that we can substitute. Like for Hungary, we can put in Italy or Japan. For the United States, we can put in a lot of Europe. And for Costa Rica, we can put in several African nations and Middle Eastern nations. So when we look at these, I just want to pay attention to the yellow or golden bars over a 5-year period. So a lot of times what we do is we look at population growth over what's called doubling time, or over 5-year or 10-year periods, whatever we're interested in looking at. And we can look at it over a time of, let's say, a pandemic versus a non-pandemic. So this varies a lot. But these graphs are just showing over a 5-year period. Why is this important? Because these graphs, I should say, because what we want to pay attention to is what's called the total population increase, that little number you see below the bars. So if we start looking at a population that has a much greater than 2 increase, and usually above a 4 is bad, that means that, I mean, if you don't want your population to grow, it's bad. But with a population number of 6%, that means that this is a rapidly growing population. And this population can get in trouble if it's in an area with limited resources, or else limited space sometimes, because you end up with a very crowded country. Some countries have a population increase of 7%, 8%, which means those are incredibly rapidly growing. That means there's a lot of children out there that will contribute to the population growth further, and this type of population can get out of control. And we notice this with wildlife too. We can measure this on wildlife or any type of organism we're interested in understanding. And of course, understanding the implications of that population growth too. Because to maintain a stable population, we can't have too great a population growth. We have to have what's called replacement growth. Now, when you look at the United States, for this data, we produce about 2.9% population growth. And that's a gentle, maybe not manageable, but it's a gentle growth rate. So people are increasing, but this type of population could absorb a little population decline, but it also is not growing so fast that we have to worry a lot about running out of resources or space, or the spread of disease, because as countries and areas get more densely populated, disease can spread more rapidly. Now, when we look at Hungary, that's my mom's home country, is we notice their population is declining over time at a pretty great rate. Now, if they're trying to decrease their population, that's good. If they're not trying, that's a problem. And that population decline can be due to, people leaving the country, but for this data, this has to do with reproductive rate. And why is this occurring during this particular time span? It might be that life is unaffordable, or people are not just wanting to have kids. A lot of times we see this drop in countries where women that normally weren't in the workforce become educated and become accepted in the workforce, and the population rate starts to drop, like what happened in Japan and a couple of other countries. So this could be good, it could be bad. And what happens in like Italy, Japan, and Hungary, this could also lead to problems economically because we run out of people, we run out of workforce. And usually what has to happen is that you have to have people immigrate. You have to encourage people from outside to come in. And you can also increase your population falsely by allowing dual citizenship for people that are linked to the country but live in other places. So these are both another way of understanding nature and gives us a hint onto what a population is doing over time. Now, please don't lose sleep over these age distribution curves, but you will likely see it on the test. And the thing is, these are open book tests, so you got the advantage of looking it up, either on the PowerPoints or the textbook. But these graphs are predictors of where a country is going as far as population growth. It also tells us prescriptively how many children are out there compared to elderly or people in the middle between 15 and 40 as far as distribution of resources. And these are very valuable in predicting economics. You could even use these in marketing where they're used, believe it or not, in the community. So these have a lot of application. They have application in business and natural resource predictions and also in even marketing a particular device. I mean, a particular item or whatever, or store or whatever, building stores. So for the first one you see in Kenya, this is typical of a rapidly growing country where there's lots and lots of children being born. So you look at the base of that. So, for that particular time, there's like, 3 million females, 3 million males. And then above that, there's another 2 million between the next age group and blah, blah, blah. And as you go up, you see less and less people there. Now, why are there less and less people? Because they're usually dying off due to some type of conditions like disease or whatever. But the point is, if those adults, if those younger people move up to the next bracket, that next bracket will be bigger, and the proportion of people dying off is actually less because it's usually a certain percentage. So what happens with this is eventually the bottom becomes a middle and gets bigger, and the middle becomes the top, and this population gets higher. And if this pyramid does not change its shape over time, but just gets wider with a narrow top, that could be a problem. Because particularly during that, what you're paying attention to is the reproductive years. Obviously, the pre-reproductive years too, because they're contributing to the reproductive years. Now look at the model for the United States. This is showing a population that pretty much the number of kids are slightly lower. So that means there might be a slight decline, but usually what happens is you go through periods of where the number of people just moves on and on and on equally until we get the slow progression of deaths. So these are usually populations where when you're looking at meeting the needs of the people, you have equal needs to be met for the young children, for the people within the 15 to 44 year group, and then from what we call the post-reproductive year, which doesn't mean you can't reproduce during that year, it just means statistically we don't very much. But so we see that dwindles. So again, we can look at resource distribution, services distribution, or marketing to those groups. And then you look at a negative growth, where again we looked at Hungary, in this case is in Italy, funny enough, I mentioned that earlier, is that we see a population that's declining, because that small number on the bottom is going to reach the middle, and that might create even smaller bottom, and there's less people to move up to the top and to the elderly. So in this type of population, we know we're losing people somehow. Usually, again, it might be birth rate in the case of these graphs, and we have to address that issue if it is an issue. But we also might know that, man, we can cut back on juvenile services, that means pre-reproductive, and focus a lot on the larger population of people, in this case, between 30 and 44, when it comes to meeting the needs of a population. So this graph shows world population for 3 different time periods. So follow along with me, because now you hopefully can understand what this is doing. So when you look at the 1950s globally, population was growing because the bottom of the period is big. And the bottom of the period is the largest part particularly larger than the reproductive group. So that means more people will be reaching reproductive age. And notice that death rate is pretty low compared to like what we saw in the Kenya example, where a lot of elderly people die. So that means when this population grows, there's going to be a lot of elderly left behind to exaggerate the type of growth. It means people are not dying off and making room for the younger people that are being born. When we look at 2010, we see that the population is somewhat stabilizing. And when we look at the predicted 2050, we're looking at again at a little more stabilization, but still population growth that could be doubling at a rate that we could use up resources. What we hope to achieve with sustainability is once we reach a certain population number is to aim for what's called zero population control. And that means what we're looking at is that last graph, which would hopefully be an achievement where we have this balance between the younger and the old, and that it maintains a stable population from year to year. So here now, to understand a population growth curve, think of this as an experiment. So in this curve, what we do is we look at a period of time, and that can mean 20 years, 10 years, whatever. It varies with the organism and their reproductive rate. Is that we can look at the number of that organism on the y-axis, the up and down axis, and the x-axis over time. So let's make believe we're looking at this rat population, or mice in this case, mice population. And now if we put one mouse in a room and say, hey, make babies, that's probably not going to work. So here we can start off with, let's say, 2 mice. And if you let them reproduce, over a period of time, they're going to get used to the environment, start reproducing, and because there's only 2 of them, it would take a while before that population grows. But after a while, you're going to start off with 2 mice, then go to 4 mice, and then go to 8 mice, because that population doubles, 16, 32. As you notice in this phase called the exponential growth phase, now the population is growing rapidly, sort of like you saw in the developing countries with a rapid population growth. Now this lag phase is just, it varies a creature to creature, it's just a period of time where the population is growing somewhat slowly, but then starts entering what's called the exponential growth phase. Now, what eventually happens in a population, if there's nothing to control population growth, and that means, you run out of environment, you run out of resources, creatures are getting overcrowded and killing each other, or there's a whole sort of factors that can go into this, is that a population hopefully will generally decelerate or slow down and reach what's called a stable equilibrium. And guys, we usually represent a stable equilibrium with a flat line. Usually it's kind of like an up and down wiggle. That means one year you have a little more growth, some years less growth, and whatever. And that has to do with predation, environmental changes, and stuff like that over time. So this is a very important thing, because what we can do this is we can learn how to understand, let's say, like mosquito populations. So if we have 100 mosquitoes that invaded an area, and we look at the mosquito growth period over time, if there's nothing to kill off those mosquitoes and there's enough food and the right conditions for those mosquitoes, they can end up taking over the area, literally into millions and millions and millions of mosquitoes in no time. So what we would have to learn to do is, how do I control that? I can take away their habitat, and that will decrease their reproduction. I can spray them, I can make the male sterile. We've done that before in mosquito control. And so again, this growth curve tells us, it gives us a predictor of, under ideal conditions, how fast does a population grow. And we could even apply this to humans. So just to review, we have this lag phase with a population growth curve. And again, this is when a population is slowly getting established, the numbers are low and getting a little higher at a time. And then we get this exponential, what's called a log phase. That means that the population is doubling rapidly, and every time the population gets bigger, the doubling has a greater effect. So if you double from 8 to 16, then 16 to 32, that is an incredible growth rate, particularly for creatures that have multiple reproductive cycles in a year. And then the deceleration phase is based on environmental conditions, so it depends. And in some cases, this phase might not be reached for a long time, or it may be reached early depending on environmental conditions. Let's say the area is depleted of food, or a storm destroys a lot of the creatures. And then we have this stable equilibrium phase where if a population reaches its peak, what we sometimes call the carrying capacity, it is living at a rate where it can't produce any more organisms because of something in nature is killing off the young or the older and making that population so that the death rate equals the birth rate. Now, something very important to understand in this class for later content is the idea of population density and spatial distribution. So first we're going to look at population density. And what this basically means is we're looking at a particular creature and how much of that creature or what number of that creature is found in a unit area. And this is going to be very important to understand, basically spacing between the creatures and whatever. So we could have an area of high population density, means things are crowded and they're living close together, or low population density. Why is this important? Because if population densities exceed the resources, that could be a problem. And if the population density is too low, it can mean creatures don't have adequate access to reproduction and population growth. So this is something we measure a lot when we start looking at protection of an environment or whatever. And we also can compare population density of two different creatures that are interrelated with each other. That means one preys upon the other as food, or one creature needs another for another, for a particular aspect of survival also. Now, population density is affected by what's called dispersal. And that means, are there organisms within a population that leave the area to another population or come into the area? So when they leave the area, movement from an area, we call it emigration. When we look at creatures moving into that area, this could be immigration. So emigration could help lower population density, and sometimes this is done in organisms. Humans did this over time as we traveled around and inhabited the earth. Or it could be due to immigration, where creatures come in and raise that population density and the absolute population in itself. So, what are some factors that limit population size? We're going to call these things limiting factors. So, limiting factor just means the most essential things in an environment that could reduce the population growth of that environment. And we talked about Maslow's hierarchy and other things in this class. So, these could be factors that affect those lower level things and also affect things like food and water, which are the basic needs. In human societies, this could be food, energy, and water. So when we look at things that affect population size, aside from reproduction, excuse me, we call these factors environmental resistance. It's almost like it's something that's putting a hold on the growth of that population. And this can include things like predators, that means creatures that eat you. Luckily, humans don't have too many. It could also be loss of a food source, lack of sunlight, accidents of nature, and also morbidity. That means disease, which could reduce that reproductive rate. So outside factors we mentioned earlier are things that the creature really has no control of in a way. What we call intrinsic factors are those factors that occur as a result of population behavior or size and whatever. And this literally is what is directly related to birth rate and death rates. That means, natality and mortality. And then we can look at what are called density dependent limiting factors and density independent limiting factors. Density dependent means it depends on the population density. So some things are not a problem until the population gets dense and dense and dense. And that includes things like the spread of disease, morbidity. So in a dense human population of an infectious disease or something like a mosquito spread disease or whatever, the population can be decimated by it spreading from people to people to people and increase the mortality rate due to that disease. Now, in density independent, it just means that this has nothing to do with how much of a population there is. So let's say you have an overcrowded population of antelope in an area, and then there's a fire that burns off that, kills a lot of organisms, a lot of antelopes and whatever, and it really does damage to the population. That fire had nothing to do, the kill rate, as you say, had nothing to do with the density of the population. Now, yes, if a population is more dense, it kills more, but basically it's still proportionate type of harm and cause of death. So if you haven't got sick of graphs yet, now we're going to look at what are called population cycles. So we can do in environmental science and in ecology, the science of ecology, we can look at two creatures and measure their population growth and change together. And what we'd have to do is pay close attention to other variables like environmental conditions, disease, and other things. But generally what we try to do is pick creatures that are somehow interrelated with each other. Either they live together in a productive manner, or one eats the other, or one provides food indirectly for the other. So what we see with these population cycles, in this case a lemming, which is a little rodent type creature, and a mink or some type of predatory animal that eats the lemmings, not lemons, but lemmings. So what we see here is the lemming population is going to be dependent on the predator population, and the predator population becomes dependent on the lemming population. So when you look at this graph, as lemmings go up, usually their upward population is due to a stagnant or downward population of the predator. Okay, now what we also can see here is that as the lemming population goes down, as predator population goes up. So again, we can see this in various other creatures. So just understand that these cycles of predator prey, okay, and don't worry about nest occupied, that, that's a measurement of our predator there. But anyway, so what we see here is that lemming population is controlled by predator population, and predator population is controlled by lemming population. If we put all this population control together, we could put it back into that growth curve we saw earlier. So we have environmental resistance, and in this case, this is for fish. So it could be oxygen supplied to the fish, because water has to have a certain amount of oxygen, and temperature could affect how much oxygen is in the water. Warm temperatures tend to remove the oxygen from the environment, and cold temperatures tend to increase the oxygen to a rate, and this affects the survivability of different types of fish. We could look at food supply, disease, predators, limited space, you name it, pollution, whatever. But for each population of creatures, we're going to see there is what's called a carrying capacity. That means how many organisms inhabit that space under a stable equilibrium or a fluctuating equilibrium. So we're going to look at this throughout the class to understand if these pressures change, what does it do to a population? So for example, if we add disease to a population of fish, it will push down that carrying capacity to the point where, creatures have a lower survivable population. Or if we decrease the amount of food to an organism, it determines that there's going to be a lower population living until something, brings back the normal environmental resistance factors. Now, yes, two more terms to learn. And this has to do with reproductive rate, again, and with juvenile deaths. So we can categorize reproduction another way. I mean, these are different ways of looking at reproduction. So one way we use, a very old way of classifying creatures, is what's called K strategists and R strategists. And why do we need to know this? Again, this helps to look at an individual organism and say, wow, they produce lots of offspring and live a short time, or they produce very few offspring and live a long time, just like those survivorship curves we see. So know this graph. I mean, you will see it on a test probably. I mean, know these terms. So whatever, so something called a K strategist, they are very stable in their environment. The organisms tend to be kind of large, not always necessarily true. Their length of time tends to be very long. That means they have a long, a significant survivorship curve. The number of offspring are usually small. Primary limiting factor is density dependent. That means their population greatly affects the number of organisms. This is a major resistance, and their population growth pattern is usually a very gradual exponential growth. Okay, so why do we need to know a case strategist? So let's say you're looking at harvesting, hunting a case strategist. You got to be very, very, very careful with how you harvest these because there's going to be very few young, and the young are supposed to live a long time. So if you start killing off all the young population, you will significantly affect the latter population, and this becomes a, a resistance in the environment that lowers that number. It becomes an environmental resistance that lowers that, carrying capacity in the environment. And this is how we sometimes see organisms that we, hunt or harvest almost go extinct. Now, in our strategists, they tend to be a little unstable in the environment. That means that a lot of them are born, they can die, and their populations can fluctuate greatly from year to year. These are usually little creatures, not always, because some trees are strategists, but the young could be little, whatever. Okay, the length of life could be very short. Um, they produce lots and lots and lots and lots of offspring, usually assuming a bunch are going to die. They tend to be sensitive to density independent factors. That means if you have a lot of adults, which is the primary part of the population living in an area, they're more susceptible to, like, let's say, a hurricane, a tornado, or something like a flood that kills off most of the population. In this type of population, the adults are the most important. They're the breeders, and there's very few of them left from the original. So out of 1,000 creatures born one year, maybe 6 might survive. And that means that those 6 are left to make hopefully the next 1,000. So if you half that 6, the next population will be 500. So when we look at managing food, like let's say in the fisheries industry, when we look at case strategists, we tend to be careful not to harvest the young. So we put, we say you have to catch the adults, particularly post-reproductive, and we can't fish the little ones. We have to leave them in the water or exclude them or throw them back. With our strategists, we got to be careful not to catch the adults and the reproductives. So we catch the little ones and use that as a food supply. Now, we're going to do with this class is we're going to focus a lot on human population as we get on with the course, because human population has the greatest impact of any other creature on Earth as far as distribution of resources, availability of resources, and negative impacts on the Earth like pollution. Because, all creatures pollute, but man, we do it in style. So when we look at the human population over time, from when we can first call ourselves humans about 2 million years ago till about today, our population has gone up steadily. Very little, steady numbers until around, 1 AD, where we started seeing growth of cities, uh, a boom in agriculture. Agriculture goes way back a long time, but we're seeing a greater increase in wealth, which basically increases survivability of young. And then we see right around the 1900s, we see this incredible boom, which is usually associated with the advent of modern medicine and the availability of medicine almost throughout the earth. So our major limiting factor we're going to see is not so much availability of food, which is important because it allowed that period of time between 1000 and about 1950s to grow pretty steadily. But what really got us was the ability to fight disease and to, particularly with water sanitation, because most of the population of this earth died from contaminated water. And this is funny, once we tamed that and were able to clean water, have better water quality, human population really, really started expanding to the point where we're still in a logarithmic or exponential growth phase. So another way to look at the human population growth issue, and this is a weird graph to look at, but we can look at doubling time for human population. So what we can see is that as far as doubling time, is that as our population gets higher, the, the doubling time gets lower. So what it used to be with humanity that, we had basically for the world's population a 400-year doubling time. Then our doubling time went from to 200 years, then 130, and now we're at the point of time where our doubling time occurs every 18 years. That is amazing and never before seen by humanity. So think about it, that our minds are probably still used to a doubling time that's probably about every 46 to 70 years. And now we're seeing it at an incredible rate. And guys, we got to prepare for this type of future, or else we got to do something about that doubling time, or we're going to reach our carrying capacity, and it's not going to be a pretty world. Now, of course, doubling time is going to vary from country to country. And what we have to be careful of is how we look at that doubling time or human population growth rate and economic development. We're going to see some videos that relate to that. But when we start looking at growing populations in areas that don't have economic development, we're going to see some catastrophic failures in the ability for people to pursue the necessary needs of food, shelter, energy, and water. And also, we have to pay attention to, as populations grow, our human waste that we produce too. We have to have an economics to handle all of that type of stuff. And if a country doesn't have it, we can kiss goodbye any environmental concerns. Countries that are able to maintain their growth and afford their growth have much more better attitudes about protecting the environment than countries that people are just barely surviving and in situations where everybody cannot get access to space or other resources. Now we're going to see a Hans Rosling video. Hans Rosling, you're going to learn about him, about the whole idea of birth rate, death rate, and having stages that we go through in societies. So when we see, with particularly human societies, is we see this thing called demographic transition. And we just need to know that as societies, you know, get a stable population, and that means whatever they're doing is working, birth rate equals death rate, sometimes this could be disrupted. That means birth rate increases, is higher than death rate, that can grow that population to the point where, it can reach carrying capacity. But usually what we'll do in that situation is usually improve agriculture, do things that keep that population growing. And then we reach what's called the demographic transition of technology. And as our population grows, usually we find ways to reduce disease, reduce death rate, a lot of times due to, malnutrition, also not feeding ourselves or lack of resources. And we can keep our population going and going and going through what's called these demographic transitions. So just think of a demographic transition as our ability to design technologies and strategies of living that reduce the death rate and increase the birth rate, but sometimes they could limit the birth rate due to ideology. And we're going to see this is true in a lot of developing countries where even though we're doing things that increase birth rate, societal structure takes on, a thinking pattern that says, I want less children. And we've discussed this a little earlier before, but we're going to see this in a video to explain this graph. It's kind of a little difficult to understand, but understand that our populations go through this period of birth rate declining, death rate declining, and birth rate sometimes declining, and then sometimes going up, and then sometimes going down. So to end this, you're going to learn about this demographic transition and about human population growth and what's behind it by taking part in the Hans Rosling assignment and a statistical software he developed called Gapminder. So please go through that assignment, and we will, and it'll help explain a lot of things that we covered in this class, particularly related to human population growth.